I'm guessing that probably everyone has put together their IEPs for the coming year, but hopefully we'll be able to cover a bunch of information that will help give you a chance to take a critical look at what you've already got in place, take a look at if there's anything that you feel like you need to make any changes on, or even advocate in the years to come. So this evening I'd like to touch on real quickly just a couple of the relevant terms, because one of the things that happens so often when you're dealing with the schools is you find that you're hearing a lot of lingo. My husband likes to tease me about it quite a bit. He calls it my psychobabble. But just cover a couple of those things so you have a little bit of familiarity if you don't already. Talk a little bit about what the difference is between a 504 and an IEP, just because that often comes up as one of those questions, what should I pursue? Then talk about what are the essential components of an IEP, and then talk about PWS specifically. So what would you want to see in the different sections of the IEP? So in terms of some of the lingo, acronyms to know, one of the things that you may hear as you're entering the elementary world is they have something that's called either RTI or a multi-tier systems of support. Typically, a child with Prader-Willi is going to come into school with services already in place, but you may also find that if your child hadn't had a lot of delays coming in, you might find that they're going to want to go through a process of providing intervention through regular education first. I think it's important to understand that that's kind of the school district's perspective, rather than just saying, oh, there's a diagnosis and we need to do something about it, because they may really want to push for some interventions at first. So it's important to know that those terms are there. Obviously, CSE, the Committee on Special Education. LRE stands for Least Restrictive Environment. So the goals based on the federal guidelines are that essentially any child with a disability should be in a classroom setting that's the most typical of their peers. Obviously, some kids aren't going to function as well there. They're going to need additional supports and services, but the goal is always to be in as typical a classroom setting as possible. You're going to hear me use the term present levels a lot during this presentation, because it's a huge component of the IEP. So if I slip and say PLEPS, what it stands for is present levels of educational performance, that we'll talk about quite a bit. FAPE is another one that you hear tossed around quite a bit. It stands for Free and Appropriate Public Education. And I think that one of the biggest words that you need to notice there, and it kind of is going to be something that defines a lot of our discussions, is the word appropriate. So often we get in the mindset of what does my child need, and what's the most appropriate, or not the most appropriate, but what's going to help them make the most gains. And a lot of times schools are going to kind of give you that, well, we're not looking for gold standard here, we're looking for appropriate. So as we're starting to look at what our kids with PWS need, you're going to want to kind of be able to keep that in the back of your mind about, you always want to be talking about, here's their needs based on appropriateness, not on what you feel like would help them be their best and be the most successful. Prior written notice, or you'll hear the term PWN, a lot of times is just about the fact that you should never be asked to just sign anything, or just do anything, or just agree to anything. Federal law mandates that you should always see something in writing to give you the opportunity to make a decision. You should always, it's essentially informed consent. So you want to make sure that you've seen something in advance. The last three terms here that may come up as part of our conversation all really have to do with if a student is having really significant behavioral needs that are interfering with their classroom success. We can talk about a functional behavioral assessment that really looks at why is a child behaving the way they are and what's kind of driving that. You can develop a behavior intervention plan to try and build those skills. And then a manifestation determination review looks at if there's a behavior of concern that results in a suspension, is that behavior connected to their area of disability? And I think that this is kind of a vital term to kind of hold on to in the back of our minds as well as we talk about Prader-Willi within the schools, because we really want to make sure that when we look at the educational impact of Prader-Willi, the reality is it's going to impact them as a whole. It's not going to just impact how they're doing as a student academically, it's going to impact their behavioral functioning. So in terms of what plan do you really want to make sure you have in place? I've kind of set up a 504 plan versus an IEP plan in this little graphic, so you can see what some of the differences are, because a lot of times people will be like, oh, a 504 plan will cover it. The reality is that a 504 plan is, while we're certainly providing them within schools, it's something that actually is driven by the Office of Civil Rights versus the U.S. Department of Education. So in terms of your ability to access, the state ed department, or asking for an impartial hearing, or really looking at a lot of those things, a lot of the protections that are afforded during or part of an IEP are not really there as strongly with a 504. A 504 is really targeting ensuring access and participation, because it's about that whole idea of, if I have a disability, can I still access my environment the same way that somebody without a disability can? Whereas an IEP really looks at that free and appropriate public education that's all about meeting unique needs, teaching skills, and preparing for adult life. So when you look at a 504, you have to have some area of disability or suspected disability that's going to impact a major life activity. Whereas when you look at an IEP, you're looking at something that's really specifically adversely affecting educational performance. So I think the primary thing to really bear in mind when you look at these two is that a 504 really isn't about providing specialized services, about special education. It's just about, how do we have to modify the classroom environment to meet a student's needs? And the vast majority of the time, this is not going to meet the needs of a student with Prader-Willi syndrome. And anytime that a school or somebody suggests to you that maybe both of them are appropriate, anything that might be covered in a 504 should absolutely be in an IEP. So a 504 is almost like a subset of what might go into an IEP. So I always say you're going to get more bang for your buck with an IEP. It's going to meet those educational needs. So I would absolutely always push for the IEP versus having a discussion about a 504. In terms of identification for having an IEP, it varies state to state, because when you look at the federal guidelines will talk about a child with a disability, and that starts at age 3, but they will also talk about just plain old developmental delays that range from ages 3 through 9. So in some states, you can actually just have an identification as a student with a developmental delay, and that can last up to age 9, and you don't have to stress about any of the other identification areas. But in other states, they look more specifically at what might be the primary factor interfering with a child's ability to learn right out of the gate. And so there's different eligibility areas. So like here in New York, some of the things that our identifications are based completely on what the federal government outlines through IDEA. So they talk about things like speech and language impairments, visual impairments, emotional disturbances, autism, traumatic brain injuries, other health impairments, learning disabilities. They do mention multiple disabilities, and this is something that I'm going to toss out, just kind of a point of reference, and if you really had a question about it, somebody could come back and ask me later. But the way a multiple disability is defined under federal law is that it's 2 or more concomitant diagnoses, and it typically goes along with having sorry, I'm looking for the exact wording. So it looks at intellectual disability and then like blindness or orthopedic impairment. Now, in the case of Prader-Willi, I could see where people would absolutely feel like, well, my student has, they have a speech and language delay, and they have an intellectual disability, and they have a learning disability. And but the reality is that when you start talking about multiple disabilities, you really start implying very, very significant delays that can be only be addressed through a very specific educational program. So typically that if you're looking at having a student within an inclusion classroom, you don't typically find students with multiple disabilities in their room because they typically need more life skills. So what I usually suggest to families is that they look more at one of the other identification areas. We personally have used what's called another health impairment because obviously Prader-Willi would fall under that category. But certainly something you could talk about with the school psychologist in your building after an evaluation. Now, and as you're talking about all of that, I would also say too that when I'm on the topic of testing, I really encourage you, it's very, very difficult to go through the testing process because we so often want to talk about what our kids can do. And we really want to look at successes. But as we move forward and we start talking about needing an IEP, really what the IEP needs to do is address unique educational needs and areas of deficit. So whenever you look at a testing situation, I would say it's okay for our kids not to be able to show everything they know. It's okay for them to struggle. It's okay for them to need additional support because that's how we really prove that our kids need that special education to be able to succeed and push forward. So right now, kind of to hit on real quickly, and then we'll talk a little bit more in depth as we look at the different individual areas in relation to Prader-Willi. Obviously, an IEP is a written statement that includes all the components that need to address the student's needs. So the way I've laid it out here is really the way that when you're talking about what your child's needs are, you should be able to help guide the conversation for IEP development. So you really want to look at where is your child right now in terms of their academics, their social development, their physical development, and their management, because you're going to look at what can they do, what are their interests, but also what are their needs. Those needs should drive development of goals. So if it's an area of deficit, then obviously that's something that you want to work towards, remediating that. So it should really, those goals should be based on where your child is right now. Those goals should really be measurable. So you need to know how have they gotten where they need to be. And they should be something that are reasonably accomplished within a year. And sometimes you see IEPs that are written with goals that are talking about having them be on grade level. And that's not really an appropriate goal because number one, if your child could be on grade level at the end of the year, then they're just typical of their peers because that's what everybody's working towards. So probably your goals are going to be below grade level, but they're going to be reflective of what your child should be able to do by the end of that current IEP. So once you know what your goals are for your child, then you need to start talking about what are the services that they need, what special education teacher services, what related services, how should their environment be modified, and then what do support staff need to know to be able to meet their needs. And you'll end up talking about what is that participation with non-disabled children going to be like. So really, as we talked earlier about that least restrictive environment, you know, how often are they going to be in with other kids? So I just want to take a moment for self-reflection because really I'm going to put up a couple of questions and your answers to these questions are really going to drive your approach to both the school staff and then in terms the expectations that they might have of your child. So think about as you're going into an IEP, what are my concerns and my biggest worries? That could include Prader-Willi related medical concerns. It might be their academics, it might be their behavior, but what are the things that are really pressing for you right now? So if you're having a conversation with their teachers, you feel like your conversation is, you know, meshing. What would you like your child to be able to do in the short term? The reality is so often we look so far down the road, we want them to, you know, be able to do all these wonderful things, but what would success feel like in the short term? What could it be within the next year? I really feel that this next question is really a vital one because it can dramatically affect how you interact with the school staff and how they interact with your child. if your child has hyperphagia, do you believe that's a behavior that can be trained away, or is it a symptom of a physical drive? The reality is that if you believe that that hyperphagia is a behavior that you can train away and you can just implement some behavior modification, in all likelihood, then any food seeking is going to result in punishment. Because the teachers are going to feel like, well, we just have to move beyond this. We have to put strategies in place, and this kid should be able to do this. But if you feel that that hyperphagia is really just a manifestation of something that your child is just intrinsically driven for, and they need to have their environment support them in not being exposed to food, then you can really build a relationship with the school around how can they help your child be successful versus trying to engage in behavior modification. And then the really big question that, comes into play is, how do I describe all of this in a way that's relevant to classroom instruction? As parents, we live in a world where we're dealing with the medical and the behavioral. Teachers are living in a world where they're trying to get our kids to learn. The reality is that the medical and the behavioral does impact how they learn, but we need to show how. We need to help the teachers understand that. We need to talk about what's going to happen if some of those more behavioral and physical needs aren't met, in a way that the teachers are going to be like, oh, all right, if I want them to be successful, then this is something that I can do. So moving forward, just to talk about different, the Prader-Willi considerations. And the academic levels are really, in a lot of respects, pretty straightforward. There's not necessarily a ton of Prader-Willi specific issues here. However, it really needs to look at more than just academics, especially for our younger kids, because when you think about their classroom functioning, you want to think about things like their speech and their language. And those functional skills for learning, because if you have a student who can't pay attention, they're self-directed and they struggle to participate in adult-directed tasks, or they're just all over the place and they're looking around, they're not going to be, really engaged with the learning process. So thinking about those things, you want to think about, like what's really important to your child in terms of how they interact with the classroom as a whole. So for example, one of the statements I had developed years ago was Noelle tends to be, she tended to be very distracted, and she was kind of doing her own thing. And I wanted the teachers to understand what's the best way to make sure that she's engaged. So one of the statements I put together was, I said, it's important to ensure that Noelle is attending to instructions, either by getting her attention prior to giving directions or asking afterwards if she understands what is expected. The reality was I knew my child, and I knew that if somebody said, do you know what you're supposed to do? She'd go, uh-huh, and that would be it. She wouldn't truly be able to explain or communicate back. So think about not just those academics, but some of those more functional skills. Looking at social development, obviously there's a lot of things about Prader-Willi. It's not just about, do they play with other kids and do they get along? The reality is there's so many factors about Prader-Willi that can impact both their engagement with other people and with how they interact with the classroom. And I'm sure that probably if you look through that list, there's things that stand out to you in terms of your child. How do they cope with frustration? Do they stay pretty even keel, or do they get really ramped up? I call them the 0 to 60 kids who just flip out in a moment where you just think everything's fine and then it's all over and done with, and they're just so upset. Food anxiety. Perseverative behavior. So are they, the kids who ask 5,000,001 questions and it's just the same one over and over and over? How do you deal with that? Rigidity. Do they need routine? Do they need to know what the schedule is? Do things need to be the same? Are they going to struggle greatly with a substitute teacher? And then how do they interact with their peers? So one of the things that I really talked a lot about in there and I've got a couple different statements to kind of reflect back on some of these. So like my child was definitely, I said she was a mother hen, but the reality was she was running everybody's show. So when I wrote some of my sample statements, I said, she's generally affectionate and easygoing. She loves to be a helper and enjoys engaging with peers. She tends to mother other children by pointing out behavioral expectations. Expressive language difficulties can interfere with her ability to communicate with adults and peers, even those familiar with her. She can be rigid in her approach to tasks and will refuse to engage in tasks or activities if pushed into a power struggle. She responds well to routine and is quick to point out when there's variation in that routine. If an activity or reward has been planned or promised, Noelle will be insistent that it occur. Consistency is essential. Behavioral expectations should be clearly stated. And in talking about the food seeking and the food anxiety, it looks different in a lot of our kids, but a lot of them just struggle with it. So here's how I described it for Noelle. I said a component of the food issue for Prader-Willi is anxiety. Having food available, visible, or being uncertain as to when food might be available can be extremely stressful for her. When she's in an environment where she knows that she'll be able to eat, what she will be able to eat, and that all food is out of her reach, she is typically focused and behaved. However, if food is available to her or she believes that she can get someone to make food available, she'll attempt to get something. She has gone to extreme lengths to obtain food, such as going into the garbage or into other students' backpacks. In situations where she's unsure of when she may eat or if she thinks she may be put in a situation where food might be available to her, she becomes unfocused on school and only focused on the food. For example, asking repeatedly if it's time to eat, when it'll be time, what she will have. This sort of obsessive, perseverating behavior is indicative of anxiety for her. And the way I've really described it to numerous teachers over the years, and it's really seemed to resonate with them, is I've talked about how they really want to see our kids be successful academically. But if their student, or Noelle in particular, is so focused on the food that they are not going to be able to access any of the instruction that they're providing. And so they've basically lost their opportunity to teach her because she's not paying attention to a word they say. So they really need to look at what can they do to structure her environment so that she can pay attention and they can all feel more successful. In terms of physical development, I think that there's a lot of different things that can impact in school. So for example, motor skills and motor planning. I mean, obviously navigating the playground and writing and being able to sit upright long enough to do their work. I really feel it's important to include in there signs of illness because our kids don't show things the same way. So like, for example, those, the temperature regulation and high pain threshold, those sorts of things. Like I always talked with the teachers about the fact that, she doesn't run fever, she doesn't vomit. So here's what to look for. And if you see these things, you've got some problems and you're going to want to give me a call. Daytime sleepiness, talk about dramatic impact on a classroom. If they're sleeping through things, they're going to miss out on a lot. Scoliosis, obviously if a kid's struggling with some of that core muscle strength and their spine is, curved and they've got the, either spinal fusion or they've got a brace on, how much is that going to impact their ability to sit and attend to things in class? I've made sure that I always mention that thick saliva and the drinking because obviously, having a water bottle at a desk could be a good thing. Obviously, the hyperphagia and the food seeking is one that you want to talk about as being a physical issue. I usually include the reduced metabolism because that's something that I talk about. This is a medical reason why we're doing all these things, and she's going to struggle to keep up with everybody. Some of our kids have really significant issues with sensory processing, whether they're under responsive or over responsive. High pain threshold, obviously, you hear the stories about kids who do things in gym or getting off the bus and they're hurt and you don't even know about it. Gastrointestinal issues are something to mention. Temperature regulation could obviously impact how they're doing, either out on the playground or in a classroom. Skin picking's a biggie. I always make sure I mention it right out of the gate just because let's be realistic. The scarring that it leaves tends to look like cigarette burns. So I think that it's important, number one, to let people know that it's an issue that's going on at home. But number two, what can they do at school to try and help prevent it a little bit? So, and I had written a couple different things, but like for her, when I talked about you know, when she starts to feel ill, the thing that they needed to watch for was, I said that, she doesn't run fever, she rarely vomits. If her behavior seems off, you notice an increase in food seeking or she blanches suddenly. These are your best signs that she's not feeling well. So then you move on to management. Management is really about how different does the classroom need to be, whether it be organized or structured or interventions provided. So does your child need additional supervision? Do they need consistency amongst adults, including communication with substitutes? We absolutely needed it. Noelle had proven time and time again that she knew if the adults weren't on the same page, she would play them. She would try and play me, and I really needed to have good communication with school to make sure that we were all on the same page. We had actually put together like a small note that went in her the substitute folder that the teacher would, leave, that basically said something in very general of, there's some students with some really significant health needs. Noelle couldn't have any food other than what had been sent in with her or approved by her parents. If you have any questions, make sure, and there were direct examples of who to talk to. So a substitute knew where to go rather than winging it and trying to figure it out on their own. We talked about the use of food and instruction, whether that be as manipulatives or rewards, because those weren't things that worked well. How are you going to handle special events? If there's a classroom party or, a big reward that somebody's earned and there's a pizza party, like how are you going to handle that? And how are you going to ask that the school work with you? And in terms of that communication with home. So for example, some of the things that we talked about that we put in here, we said that Noelle shouldn't be allowed to eat anything other than what's provided from home or has been previously approved by her parents. Obviously, each one of our kids handles how that's presented to them differently. I have a friend who had shared that her son is a rules man and he just needed to know that this is the rule and it's over and done with. My child is very much I want to have control. So if I have some say in what's going to happen, I am going to go along with it a whole lot better. So what we found for Noelle that we included in her IEP was that she responds well if reminded that she has her own special food rather than simply being told that she cannot have something else. We talked about the fact that food could not be used as a reward for her or even others in her group. She can become distraught that other people are given food and will become visibly upset. Rewards should be in the form of non-edible items such as stickers or special privileges. We talked about what does that look like in terms of food in the classroom. So for Noelle, we said all food items in a classroom setting should be secured in a location out of her reach. During snack and meal times, Noelle needs to be carefully monitored to ensure that she does not beg or take food from her peers. The disposal of leftover food should also be monitored, as Noelle will eat off someone else's plate or out of the trash on occasion. And then we had said that basically any upcoming celebrations involving food need to be addressed with her parents ahead of time. So we needed to talk with them, come up with a plan, and have it in place ahead of time. So for each of those things that we've talked about, I'm hoping that you're able to reflect a little bit on what stands out to you about your child. And, is it truly being described in a way that impacts them in the classroom so that others can understand? So once you've put together those present levels that really describe your child and both what they can do and what their needs are, that should drive everything else for the remainder of your IEP. So obviously talking about goals, those goals need to align with the student's specific needs that are outlined back in your present levels. You're going to really want to talk about how will you know when your child has achieved those goals. You don't want it to be like just some nebulous statement where you're like, I don't know if they met that goal. Your goals should very clearly lay out that your child will be able to do this many times to know that they've accomplished it. You're going to start talking about what services, modifications, and supports for school personnel are needed to help your child keep moving forward. So, and let me just look real quickly. So, no, I'm going to go back. So in terms of services, there's a gamut. Do they need special education teacher services? Would those services be best within the classroom where they have typical peers to model their behavior after and to feel encouraged that they really want to do that? Or is your child so overwhelmed by the general education environment that they're they're not making gains. They're frustrated, and their behavior is like showing that they're frustrated, and they really need a smaller classroom setting. I'm not a proponent of advocating for one over the other for our kids with Prader-Willi, because I think the reality is you need to look at each one of our students individually. Some kids do better starting out in those more self-contained classes, and gaining the skills that they need to eventually start pushing back out into more mainstream classes. Other kids deserve a shot to really try and do well. They're motivated by other kids. They want things to, they want to do stuff with other kids, and that to them, they're driven by it, because they want to keep up. How does your school or how does your classroom need to be modified? So some of the things that we talked about in terms of, do they need directions repeated? Do they need food out of sight? Do they need a teacher assistant? Do they need individual support? How do things need to change? If you look at what your kid needs in comparison to the others to be successful in a classroom, what needs to be different? Supports for school personnel. Those are often things that talk about what does the school staff need to be able to meet my child's needs. So for example, a specific training. I've actually presented to the school staff every year that Noelle's been in school. We work it out. We usually do it on the first day of school when all the teachers are there, but the students aren't. We usually build in about 45 minutes to an hour where I do a quick overview of what the syndrome is, and then I talk about Noelle very specifically, and then we have a chance to do question and answer so the teachers can say, oh, well, this is how I usually structure my classroom. What should I do differently? And we talk it through. And I think that that's just been vital. Some parents aren't as comfortable doing that, so they might reach out to their state Prader-Willi organization, to national. They might take advantage of some of the more specific trainings that are put out by PWSA USA, or for example, Dr. Elizabeth Roof does some really nice stuff. But whether it's a parent, an expert, an advocate for your state organization, videos, think about how can you help train your staff so that they are ready. Because one of the things that I've found, and teachers have said that it's made a world of difference, is if we say that we're just going to wait and see how things start out, Noelle goes into it, she remembers what didn't go well, and that person is basically her target, because she really will remember what didn't go well, and she's going to try and make it work to her advantage in the future. And it also really helps the other children in the classroom, because if a teacher walks into the classroom with a clearly defined plan of what will and won't be allowed and is ready to communicate that out to the other parents in advance, then there's no backtracking, there's no resentment. It's just kind of a, here's how it's going to be. Probably the best way that we looked at that was when we looked at, once my daughter hit the high school, a lot of times kids didn't have lunches, and so they were bringing food into classes. And I talked to the teachers about, your students who might be missing a lunch and want to eat in your classroom are going to resent you if you let it happen and then you take it away, or they're going to resent my child, which is not fair to her either. So let's plan to make everything ready to go the minute they walk in the door, rather than trying to figure it out as we go along and maybe building some bad habits along the way. And then I think, as I mentioned previously, well, the goal is always to be in the least restrictive environment. Where's their progress toward their goal is going to be best accommodated. And for some kids, the social, emotional, and the behavioral goals are so overarching that they're not getting to some of the more academic goals. So they do need some different places to kind of work on those things. So practical advocacy. So things to think about as you go in. Because obviously Prader-Willi is not as well known. You're trying to really advocate for some things that just seem unusual to people. What I always say when I walk in, well, in my own head, and I encourage other parents to do, is I say, think about what is your gold standard and what's your, okay, I can live with this. What's your fallback? And probably the best example I can think of for this is when my daughter was entering elementary. I really wanted her to have a one-to-one, but I knew in my head that you know what, even if they don't give me this one-to-one, where does she need additional supervision? And I knew it was, during transitions, in the lunchroom, places where she might be exposed to food. So when I went into the meeting, I obviously advocated for the one-to-one. But I had in the back of my mind, and it's kind of freeing to know, you know what, even if they don't give me what I'm asking for, here's what I can be okay with. Because if you have that fallback position, and you end up having to go with something that maybe you're not, it's not what you really, really wanted, but it's something that you're like, okay, I can live with this. Then start thinking about, you know what, we're always going to be pushing towards that higher level of support that I want. So what do I need to do to prove that? So what are the things that could be, data could be collected on? You set a timeline for when are we going to follow up? When are we going to come back? An example of this might be there was a child in my state where he had some really significant daytime sleepiness, but they wanted to essentially write naps into his IEP, and the school was pretty resistant to that. But what we talked about was, I said, you know what? I said, let's talk about, okay, he needs breaks. I said, but I also want you to collect data on how often is he falling asleep, when is it happening, and how long is it lasting for? And if you continually wake him up, I want you to time how much classroom instruction he's missing because of that. The reality was he was probably going to be missing more classroom instruction through trying to get him awake and more behaviors resulting from that than he would have if they had just scheduled in a 20-minute break that might be provided as a nap. So if you say, okay, you know what, we won't write in a nap, but I want all this information about how much it's impacting his classroom functioning, and then I want to come back in a month and talk about what we're going to do to address that if it continues to be a concern. And then I always tell people, document, document. The reality is any conversation you have, follow up in some way in writing. It doesn't have to be adversarial. It could be a quick email off to the person you talk to saying, hey, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today. I really appreciate that we're going to be, say, for example, talking about the kid who wasn't going to get naps. I really appreciate the fact that you're planning on doing the data collection. I think it's going to be great that we're looking at this, that, and the other thing. I'm looking forward to meeting on such and such a date so that we can, continue to discuss this. Then that way it takes away the whole, well, you said, or coming back, or people indicating that they never, had heard that conversation. So certainly, even though you're documenting and you're putting it in writing, you can do it in a way that sounds very pleasant and engaging, but yet lets people know that you're monitoring and keeping an eye on things. And the other thing I'd really like to encourage you as you look at this is a journey. What I really found when I went back and looked at Noelle's IEPs over the years, I thought I had some great stuff in her IEPs when she was very young. And those things, in some respects, I wrote some really good stuff that is actually, though it's evolved slightly, it's still there in her IEP as she gets ready to go into her senior year of high school. In other respects, I realized there were things I left out, and we needed to come back and revise it. There were services that maybe, she should have had or she shouldn't have had, or, but the reality is you always have annual reviews. You're going to have reevaluations every 3 years. You're always going to be revisiting. You always have the right to go back and put, a request in writing to ask to meet again and talk. So even if you look at your IEP and you're like, oh, I wish I had done or included such and such, there's always opportunities to revisit, to talk, to change. And your child's going to change and grow and evolve over the years too. So remember that it doesn't have to be perfect right out of the gate. Think about the things that are important right now, but also know that, if it's not perfect right away, you do have plenty of opportunities to keep pushing forward.
Thank you, Amy, for your presentation today. If you have any questions, please submit them via the question box on your screen. Amy, while we're waiting for people to start typing out some of those questions, will you be able to share copies of the statements that you've developed in the past?
Absolutely. I'd be more than happy to share those out. They've those are the sorts of things that it's so nice to have to look back and reflect on. Does your child align with somebody else's, or what's a little bit different? So I'd be more than happy to share out the different things I've developed over the years. We can get those out via email.
Fantastic, thank you. And we have a first question in from Christine. Do you think if you're requesting a one-on-one, then you should just put in special ed class?
So no, I think that if you're requesting a one-on-one, that's a modification outside of, and maybe I'm misunderstanding the question, so you can go ahead and add some additional notes if I'm not entirely addressing your question. But I don't know that you necessarily need to have a special education class if you have a one-to-one, because the reality is one-to-ones, depending on their level of training, some are just paraprofessionals where they're really there to kind of help, supervise, redirect, and help them attend, whereas others are trained teaching assistants where they can actually help to provide some instruction. So if you have a child that might need some additional reteaching or might need some chances just to go back over the material, but overall is going to be successful, perhaps they're in an inclusion class, perhaps they're in a resource class outside of their regular class, but I don't know that you need to specifically be talking about a special class where it's just students with disabilities if you're looking at a one-to-one. In fact, to be honest, a lot of times what ends up happening is if you end up looking at a special class, the ratios are higher, so you have more adults to the number of kids. So you might have one teacher with 2 teaching aides with 12 kids. So your child might not actually need a one-to-one in that setting. Whereas if they're out in a typical classroom where there's one teacher and then a special education teacher only pushes in for a portion of the day, they're probably going to need higher levels of adult support to monitor and support them in that setting. I hope that makes sense and it addresses the question.
I think it did. We have another question in from Ruth. If your child is in a special ed class already in pre-K and not having a one-to-one, but the classroom aids during this COVID time, would you advise any specific things to be added as a precaution in their IEP?
Well, and if they're in a preschool classroom, there again, a lot of times, and depending on your state, there's less kids in that preschool classroom. So there tends to be that higher level of adult support. So my question as you come into the elementary is, what's going to be different about the classroom structure? How are they going to meet those needs for supervision and engagement that were probably being met through the higher levels of adult support within a preschool special classroom? So don't just be like, oh, well, this is how they did it in preschool, so it'll be fine to continue on into elementary. Ask the questions about how the classroom is differently structured and what they're going to do to meet those needs. Because the reality is you typically go into a classroom with more kids and less adults. So you might need additional adult support for that classroom.
Thanks, Amy. It looks like we don't have any more questions right now. I'm going to hold off for just a few more minutes to see if anybody else has a question or two. But while we're waiting, I know some people are probably interested to know if you would be doing another webinar for the next age group up. So you've done one for us on preschool and now elementary. Will you be doing another one on the next age group up?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's vital because I think what happens is a lot of the information and some of the questions you ask stay the same, but the setting within which you're having to address those needs changes. So as you start looking at middle school, you tend to start looking at, are they changing classes rather than just being in one classroom all day long? They're just starting to change in terms of their personalities, and their peers are too. Because as you go into those middle school years, their peers tend to need a lot of support as well in terms of their social interactions. And then as you start looking even further on into high school, then you start talking about that long-term planning and transitioning out of high school eventually. So definitely would love to, continue to talk about all these things as the as the setting changes and the kids grow.